Lesson 6, Chapter 7, Britain and Empire, 1870 to 1910. This chapter examines developments in the late Victorian and Edwardian periods, that is, from 1870 until 1910. Queen Victoria reigned until her death in 1901, where she was succeeded by her eldest son, who became King Edward VII, who reigned from 1901 until his death in 1910. This period marked a high point of the British Empire, and the chapter thus focuses on international developments. During this late Victorian and Edwardian period, British imperial expansion increased, the empire grew, and the empire became an even larger part of British civic and cultural life at home. The person of Queen Victoria provided stability during the later 19th century. Although she largely retreated from public life following the death of her husband, Prince Albert, in 1861, in fact wearing black the rest of her life, Victoria reigned a very long time. In the later 19th century, she became more and more identified with a belief in Britain's greatness, with a pride in the empire, with a belief in the virtues of British imperialism. Her Diamond Jubilee celebration in 1897, marking her 60th year on the throne, was thus also an imperial celebration. Mark Twain's observation on the Jubilee and the symbolic fusing of monarch and empire is worth noting. Quote, "In her the public saw the British Empire itself. She was a symbol, an allegory of England's grandeur and the might of the British name." Victoria's reign also transformed the monarchy into a less biased, less interventionist institution in politics and government. Part of the reason for this was how Victoria saw the proper roles of men and women in society and public life. Although she was the head of the most powerful country in the world and the largest empire the world had ever known, she fundamentally saw politics and government as a sphere for men, where the woman's place was at home. Thus, her monarchy was strongly identified with domesticity on the one hand, but also imperial power on the other. Victoria had 9 children. Indicative of the increasing identification of the monarchy with empire, in 1876, Disraeli's conservative government passed legislation creating the new title for Victoria as head of state in India. She was now Empress of India, a grand title indeed. As the text discusses, Victoria took great pride and interest in the British Empire and Britain's new territorial possessions. Indeed, after 1870, the pace of imperial acquisition hastened. This was a period of the empire's expansion, a process sometimes referred to as the New Imperialism. Between 1870 and 1900, in Asia and Africa, Britain acquired over 5 million square miles of new territory and a population of 80 million people. In the closing decades of the 19th century, European nations remapped the contours of empire. The piecemeal expansion of earlier decades gave way to systematic campaign of conquest and occupation of much of Africa and Asia. This new imperialism was tied up with national pride, as expansion of European nations' territories seemed proof of their greatness. The new imperialism was usually explicit policy of government, though in some cases there was a revival of imperialism by chartered companies. There was, for example, the Imperial British East Africa Company, which administered Kenya and Uganda, and the British South Africa Company, which administered Southern Africa. Another element of the new imperialism was that it included new players. The original world empire powers had been Spain, Portugal, Britain, and France. In the later 19th century, different nations competed for territories: Germany, Belgium, Italy, the United States, and Japan. And finally, this new imperialism was characterized by desire for formal control of new territory. No longer content with informal influence, countries sought explicit territorial occupation and political conquest. For new powers such as Germany, it became imperative to acquire colonies as a form of state pride and to gain recognition as a world power. World powers had colonies. In Britain's case, it was, and is still now, sometimes claimed that the widespread British imperialism was not planned, that it happened haphazardly. This view, as noted in the text, was put forth in 1881 by the British historian Sir John Seeley, who wrote that Britain had, quote, conquered and peopled half the world in a fit of absence of mind. This both made the process of imperial expansion seem much easier than it was, and, as important, made it seem less open to criticism, since the view argued that it seemed almost a matter of chance that it happened the way that it did. No point in getting concerned or overly disapproving of the British Empire if it did not develop by conscious policy. Another factor in the growing imperialism of the later 19th century was technology. Technological advances, such as the steamship, now allowed for greater exploration. For example, ships could now explore inland rivers in Africa instead of being held to the coasts. New medicines also allowed Europeans to explore African interiors and overcome diseases such as malaria, which was treated and prevented with quinine, which was taken from the bark of an African tree. Superior military technology, such as breech-loading rifles and machine guns, made conquest more assured. There was also, in places, a genuine belief in a civilizing mission. Today this strikes us as very paternalistic, the idea that the Victorians would civilize and raise up the native peoples of Africa, Christianize them, building schools and so on. At the time it was seen as a duty of a more advanced people, that it was for the definite benefit of the Africans. Africa was one of the major sites for European imperial expansion in the last decades of the 19th century and early 20th century. European powers eventually divided up almost all the continent among themselves. Consider a map of Africa in 1880 from a European perspective. There are few European possessions, and they are all located along the coasts. The interior of the continent is unconquered, again from a European perspective. Then, consider a map of Africa from 1914, and you see that most of the continent has been carved up between European powers. In the case of Africa, the European powers acted like Africa was a resource to be claimed and occupied, that there were only so many valuable unclaimed territories left in the world, and European states competed to get theirs. Thus, this quick imperial conquest of Africa is often referred to, tellingly, as the scramble for Africa. The textbook examines the unique case of Egypt and Britain, and the strategic importance of Egypt controlling the Suez Canal, which was so vital to the British Empire. The case of Britain and the Sudan is also explored, with General Charles Gordon and the siege of Khartoum that so fascinated and enraged Britons in the 1880s. Sudan remained under British control until the 1950s. While Gordon was celebrated as a martyr for British imperialism in Africa, the one man most synonymous with British imperialism in Africa was Cecil Rhodes, the British businessman, mining magnate, and politician. Buying up diamond mines in South Africa, he had a near monopoly on the diamond trade there, and with it tremendous wealth. He strongly believed in British imperialism and helped the British South Africa Company extend its territory to create two new colonies named after Rhodes himself: Northern Rhodesia, which is now Zambia, and Southern Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe. The spread of the empire was important for Britain as a nation, but it also mattered to everyday Britons in their lives. It was a point of pride and identity. British consumers encountered a wide variety of imperial goods, and the empire figured prominently in advertising in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as well as in popular music, literature, and the school curriculum. Rudyard Kipling, for example, was one of the most important writers associated with the empire, bringing exotic tales to the British reading public, such as The Jungle Book. For a Briton in 1900, it would be difficult to imagine Britain without its great empire. They seem to go hand in hand, and that it should always be that way. The textbook discusses some of the other ways in which the empire was encountered in Britain, in food, in foreign visitors, especially Africans and Asians. All, of course, was not rosy with the empire, and there were critics at home and challenges abroad. The great imperial crisis of the late Victorian period was the Boer or South African War. The most serious colonial conflict Britain faced was not thus with a European state, such as France or Germany, but with the white settlers of Dutch descent in South Africa, the Boers or Afrikaners. The Boers were descendants of 17th and 18th century Dutch settlers to the south of Africa. Conflict arose over which white population should dominate southern Africa. Who would rule in the area, the British or the Boers? In the 1830s, the Boers had trekked north out of the Cape Colony to escape British rule there and established two republics, the Orange Free State, and the Transvaal, which were free from British rule for several decades. The discovery of gold mines in the Transvaal in the 1880s led to turmoil as the gold mines turned the Transvaal into a prosperous state. Britain feared that the Transvaal might become an ally of Britain's growing rival, Germany, and indeed, the Boers began buying arms from Germany. In this context, too, was the fact that there had been increasing British migration into the Transvaal, without the political rights and status that these British migrants felt they deserved. A war between the British and the Boers was thus provoked in 1899. The British expected an ease of victory in this David and Goliath conflict, as the British had overwhelming advantages in men and resources. What the British got instead was a drawn-out guerrilla war in the countryside. The British reputation was greatly stained by its heavy-handed tactics during the war, including scorched earth strategies, burning hundreds of farms, and most significantly, establishing the world's first concentration camps. Over 100,000 Boer civilians were removed from rural areas to prevent them supporting the Boer fighters. In these prison settlements, over 28,000 people died, mostly women and children, due to malnutrition and disease. The British were finally victorious in 1902, and in 1910, the Boer republics and Cape Colony entered into the Union of South Africa.